Looks like we are live on Instagram. Let's see about Facebook. There we go. Okay, technology is on board. Last week I had a little difficulty with the microphone, so hopefully this week y'all will be able to hear me okay. So welcome to Homestead Healing. My name is Laura Ann. I am your heart and healing mentor. For those of you who don't know me or what that means, I am a light on your healing journey. I empower empaths to overcome emotional overwhelm so that they can thrive in the life of their dreams. And I learned how to do that for myself because I am a very empathetic person. I identify as an empath. And so I've really felt called, especially during the time of this pandemic, but just in general, to focus in and help empaths to fine-tune the tools in their toolkit and really add to their support system so that they're able to cope and go beyond coping into thriving within relationships and within the relationship with themselves and the world at large. So one of the really big foundational lessons that I had to learn to do this for myself was learning about boundaries. This was a word that I feel like 10 years ago was really not in the common vernacular, and now it's coming up a lot more, which is phenomenal. But there's still some mystery around it, and I want to just knock that mystery out of the park today and just set some really clear definitions and clear up, what boundaries are, why we set them, and how we do that. So, just in general, first of all, empaths are people, if you're wondering what that means, an empath is someone who is very sensitive to the emotional energy of others, to energy in general, and that we feel the emotional energy of our context very acutely. And so we need more tools than maybe your average Joe to create boundaries, to separate, and to be able to distinguish between ourselves and everything we're in relation to. And that essentially is what boundaries are. So there's a ton of different kinds of boundaries. That's a whole nother video that I'll get into on the different kinds of boundaries and how to work with each one. But today we're talking just general boundaries. And in general, boundaries are your rules of engagement. That's how I like to think about it. Just your rules of engagement. They're like your limits. They're how you want to experience yourself in relation to other people. And one of the things about boundaries is they're really learned and so kind of inherited from our parents and our immediate family. And our parents learned / inherited their boundaries and understanding of boundaries from their parents, and on and on and on. So working with boundaries, it's this really beautiful thing because not only is it healing for you, but it can also be a healing experience that will have ripple effects through your ancestral line as well. And then more immediately in your own family, it can be a kind of a domino effect that will start to really heal family dynamics. Not always, but sometimes that's sort of the best case scenario. It's a really cool experience to see happen. So the other thing about that inherited aspect of boundaries is that it can feel really triggering when we're setting boundaries with family because it is such a deep-rooted thing that is being challenged, and change is difficult for a lot of folks, for most humans, and it can feel for some like really triggering for past things that have happened with, like if I were to work on boundaries with, my father, he might end up feeling triggered about something that happened with his father, right? So that's just something else to keep in mind as we go through this. The talk around boundaries and setting boundaries, especially with family, but with anyone, can feel triggering to the person you're setting boundaries with. Just an FYI. So since empaths connect easily to other people's emotional energy and feel what others are feeling for themselves, within themselves, boundaries are especially important. And to simplify it, there's really sort of 3 general steps to boundary setting. And I actually came up with like these little, I need to get a whiteboard. My plan was to use these visual aids, but I realized on Instagram it's backwards. So I will be sending this video out to my email list. If you're interested and you're not on my list yet, you can subscribe on my website, homesteadhealingatx.com. That's homesteadhealingatx.com. And you'll get videos like this and just in general, some yummy support from me to help you through the healing journey that you're on right now. So the first step in setting boundaries is to create the boundary, right? So in creating the boundary, what you want to do is create some space for yourself to feel into your why. Why do you need to set this boundary in the first place? There can be, you want to get clear on the emotional why, on the self-care why, what are your motivations? What's going on with you where you're like, hey, I need to set this boundary. My therapist actually earlier this year said something to me that I had never put together, but is so simple and amazing. Boundaries are a healthy expression of anger. So anger is totally justifiable, great reason to set a boundary. Like, I'm setting a boundary because this behavior infuriates me. Yes, do it. Set the boundary. It's an actual healthy expression of that anger that is going to, stop that situation from happening in the future. So feel into your why. That's going to be really important in general in any endeavor, but especially with this as we get into maintaining boundaries. You want to get very clear on your why. I recommend writing it down. Have a little journal session, create some time to feel into the undercurrents of why you're feeling this boundary needs to be set for yourself with this other person, whatever kind of relationship you have with them. And then once you're very clear on your why, start to feel into what specifically needs to change. Hi, Sarah. It's great to see you. So now you know why the boundary needs to be set. Visualize in the relationship that you feel that would be healthy and everything you want it to be in that situation. What would need to change for the relationship to feel good? Like, what would need to change in order for the why to be satisfied, right? So for me, I'll give an example. I love my parents. Every parent-child relationship has its issues. And, so one would be, my mother is a worrier, and she's a chronic worrier. She comes from a family of chronic worriers. And so it's a very, it goes back generations, I'm sure. And one of her first instincts as protective mama bear, when I tell her anything that I'm doing that to her feels scary or puts me at risk, whether personally or professionally, her immediate response historically was to kind of naysay, right? And sort of do a risk analysis on whatever it was I was telling her I was going to do. And even if I had already gone through all of that myself and made a very informed decision, this is what I'm doing for myself in my life, she would then go through all of that with me again. And I finally had to really set a boundary with her because it was really affecting me energetically. It was causing, me to doubt myself and have confidence issues and feel like mom didn't believe in me. And so there was a few different whys. And what I decided needed to change was that she wouldn't verbalize those things to me. And if she really felt like it was extremely important in her job as my mother to warn me about something, that she had to ask my permission to do that. So those are the 2 big behaviors that needed to change in setting that boundary within the relationship with my mom. So the next step is probably the hardest step. Well, they can all be challenging. But especially for empaths, it's sort of the catch-22. Like, communicating what the boundary is to the other person, because the fear of how they're going to react, because we feel so deeply the other person that empaths tend, we don't want to hurt people, right? And so that fear of hurting the other person will sometimes silence us. Don't fall into that trap. Create the boundary and then communicate the boundary. That's step number 2. Communicate the boundary. And a big important part, I'm going to get this so you can see it. If you're taking notes, that's great, but I am going to send this out. Communicate the boundary. You want to be sure when you're communicating the boundary, of course, be compassionate. You don't try to communicate a boundary in the middle of a fight where you're all revved up. You want this to be a calm, collected conversation where you're being really clear on why the boundary needs to be set and exactly what the boundary is that you're setting. And then once you've communicated the boundary, separate yourself from the other person's emotional reaction. And there may not be one. It may be like, totally cool, I feel you, I didn't even realize I was doing this, let's change it, I agree it's not a healthy dynamic. That's best case scenario. Very frequently, because these are old ingrained patterns of behavior that we may not even be conscious of, that can then be inherited from parents or from past relationships, it can feel very triggering. It can feel for the person that you're communicating this boundary to, maybe like they're being under attack. And so it's important for you to separate yourself from their reaction. And this is important all the time to remember, but especially in setting boundaries. You are not responsible for the other person's emotions. You are not responsible for the other person's feelings. Okay, so really center around that. And that doesn't mean you want to be a total dick about the way that you communicate. Of course, be thoughtful and considerate. Hi, Chris. But just however they react, distance, have a little bit of distance, have a little bit of a boundary between their emotional response and what it is that you've said. It's helpful to anchor into your why here. As you're talking, really feel into that. Like, this decision, this boundary is in alignment for my highest good. That's why I have to communicate it to this other person. And then the third step, let me get my I know on Instagram it's backwards, guys, but subscribe to my email list and I'll send you a video with it not backwards. And the third step is to maintain. So you really want to be prepared to reestablish the new boundary over time. And over time is the key point here. It's going to take time, right? This isn't going to be something that just evaporates overnight because you verbalized the boundary. You're going to have to consistently maintain and uphold this boundary that you've set, because you're basically saying, hey, the way that we've been for like my entire life or for the whole time that you've known me, yeah, that's not going to fly anymore. I'm basically saying I'm going to be showing up partially as a different person with you in this relationship. And that can, take time to sink in for both parties. It's easy to fall back into old habits. So the key for that maintenance component, once you see the boundaries being crossed, just compassionately call them out, right? Like, for example, with my mom, it will still happen. And she's getting really good at it. I could see the change. It's so fun and amazing to see, where we'll be on the phone and she'll start to say something. Then she's like, oh, actually, you know what? I'm just not going to say it. Or she'll go, oh, actually, I feel like I have some really important input. Is it okay if I tell you why I'm worried about this? And she asks for permission, right? So, but that took time. That took her offering up the worrywart stream of consciousness about whatever it was I was doing, and me saying, hey, Mom, like, I know that comes from a place of love, but it's crossing that boundary, right? I don't want to hear about the worrywart syndrome. I've got enough of that internally. Cool. So that boundary has to be continually re-communicated in order to maintain its integrity. And just remember, they're a work in progress, right? I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day, as they say. It's a journey. And so, you don't want to be like really pissed or critical or judgmental that it doesn't happen overnight. Just, it is a work in progress. And, as you go along, that boundary may change. It may start to need to look a different way because nothing is static and we don't live in a vacuum. And change does take time. So just keep that in mind. You helped create this dynamic. That's another thing to remember, that by allowing, even if you had this truth of what the boundary needed to be for you for a long time and you didn't verbalize it, right? So you've been feeling like that boundary's been violated for a while, or you have felt icky about it for a long time, but it took you years to finally know what a boundary was and how to communicate what it is. Like, all of those years that you didn't communicate it, you participated in the dynamic of that line being crossed because it was an invisible line. Until you verbalized and manifested that line, the other person didn't know they were crossing a line because they couldn't see it. So you were both responsible for the creation of that dynamic. And since you are both responsible for it, it's going to take both of you working on it to change the dynamic. And it can change, and it will change. It just takes consistency and commitment, like anything else in life, right? So that is the way that you do it. I find it to be, I feel like everything, I've been doing some exercises recently and thinking about what helpful tools and content I could create for all of y'all, but especially my empaths out there. And boundaries comes up with almost everything. I mean, it's just one of the most foundational things. And so I will be diving more into this in the upcoming days, weeks, and months. If you identify as an empath or not, if you just are working on boundaries in general and you have any specific questions about it, oh, here we got one. How do you handle a situation where someone establishes a new boundary and then crosses a boundary that they created? Is it the same? So they establish a new boundary and then they cross that same boundary that they created. So ultimately, since they're the one that has created the boundary, like, it's their ultimate responsibility. But since you're involved in that relationship and you care about it, right? I would say it sort of depends. Your reaction is going to depend on how invested you are in that relationship. It's going to depend on how much it affects you personally as to whether or not you want to invest the time and energy to address that boundary. If it's a coworker and they're kind of snarky about like coffee cup stuff, and they come to you and they create a boundary that's like, hey, this is my favorite coffee mug. If you use your coffee mug, I'll use my coffee mug. And then you walk in the next day and they're using your coffee mug and it really pisses you off and you feel like you've got to say something, say it. Call them on it. It's a two-way street, right? If you don't really care about the coffee cups and you come in and you see that and it makes you laugh, then just laugh it off and don't say anything because they're the one who's more invested in the boundary. Does that make sense? Cool. Any other questions like that, y'all feel free to hit me up in my DMs. You can always email me, laura@homesteadhealingatx.com. And if you're not already subscribed to my email list, you get a free self-care guide when you do that on my website, homesteadhealingatx.com. I love you so much. I know that these are some really challenging times, and I think especially in the pandemic setting, when you're living with other people, boundaries can be a really helpful tool. So if you start to work on these over the next few days or the upcoming weeks and you want more support, again, I'm here. I see you. I'm available to support you. And I'm sending you a lot of love and healing light. Namaste.